All right, welcome back, everyone. This is our last session. Again, thanks to BP for sponsoring the coffee break. Without the support of our sponsors, it would not be possible for us to be all here together. So I'm going to take one more quick moment to thank all of our esteemed sponsors. Husky Energy, JuneWarren-Nickle's Energy Group, Enbridge, Synovus, AMEC, Fluor Canada, Suncor, BP Canada, Talent Hub, APEGA, Schulich School of Engineering, Shishi Couture, Willow Park Wine, Digicopy, Spa Lady, and the Sandman Hotel. We could give another round of applause for our sponsors. Excellent. Now our next speaker is Bill Whitelaw, CEO of JuneWarren-Nickle's Energy Group. Bill is here to share his experience in how to attract and engage female professionals in the energy sector and beyond. Bill joined JWN in 2002 and has been responsible for expanding the company's product portfolio and developing new frontiers within the industry. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bill Whitelaw.
So I'm going to make Lenore feel good about actually having to, as a short guy, pull the mic down. Perfect. So thanks very much. I know the challenges of being between you and the reception and the wine and that sort of thing, but I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey today and build on some of the themes that have been laid down by Catherine and Anne in terms of communication, but take you outside your organizations and a little bit outside your gender and reflect on some major industry challenges that we face, and then loop back and describe to you why I think that groups like the people in this room really are going to be the industry's salvation in the future. And if you can see by the title of my presentation, I'm covering a lot of ground. I'm going to cover things that relate to the social license to operate and energy literacy and gender-based communicative advantages. You know, and when I was discussing with Sharon what I would talk about, I said, I'm really uncomfortable with the notion of bridging the gender gap, because the verb bridging implies that the gap will always be there. I'm much more comfortable with words like smashing or dissolving or getting rid of it. Because if we are always focused on bridging the gender gap, those on the other side of the bridge will always continue to say there's a bridge to be built. So let's see if I can get the technology working.
We may have lost the batteries in that.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just... So, like Anne, I'm a big believer in storytelling narrative. These are my two daughters, Moira and Morgan. And it's not that they're exceptionally bad at applying makeup, but they participated in the rad race this year. They don't often get along so well, and I thought I would memorialize that moment in print. But Moira, the older one, who is in her last year at the Haskayne School of Business, really, I think, is a victim of the 82-2 rule. I'll let you ponder that for a moment. Think about that. How many of you have been to the Petroleum Club in one form or another? How many are members of the Petroleum Club? See, there's that telling response. 82 is the number of male presidents the Petroleum Club has had since it was founded, and 2 is the number of female presidents. And I use the Petroleum Club as a member, and I have for years, not because I like brass rails and wood paneling and the gravitas of the organization. For me, it's just convenient. But in the last number of years, I've had this really eerie experience, and it just happened to me yesterday when I was hosting a delegation from Sweden. And I took them to the Petroleum Club for lunch, and I can tell when I take an outsider to the Petroleum Club that there's something they just can't describe in the room. And I said, it's like every Rotary Club meeting you go to on Monday afternoons, isn't it? And that's exactly what they sense. They sense, why is this full of middle-aged white men? Where are all the women in the club? And I have to go into this long narrative about women are allowed here, but they actually choose not to come here for the institutionalized reason. And so how that bears on my daughter, in a couple of years ago when she was debating what her major would be, and I think about the institutionalization of the masculinity of the sector and how much of a problem that is I said, why don't you try Petroleum Land Administration? It's a great career and it offers all kinds of opportunity. And she went away and she consulted with her student peers, her friends who had graduated, her faculty, and came back and said, Dad, I'm going to choose HR because that's where my career path lies as a woman in this industry. And really, when I think about the 80, it's very personal for me in terms of her younger sister going to be following along in a few years, and described it well, and when she mentioned the glass obstacle course in terms of the challenges that they face. But I hope over the course of my presentation to give you some insights where I think you as engineering and technology professionals have a real advantage over your male counterparts. So the challenge with an audience of a diverse age, if you're like me in your mid-50s, this is a pop culture reference from the 90s that the younger members of the audience might not, you might have heard your moms talk about it, but it's based on a very, very famous work about men being from Mars and women being from Venus. But I would reframe that and move away from gender politics and say, we've got a real challenge in this industry. In one sense, tying it to a communications argument, and I'll get into it in a moment, is that the petroleum industry is actually from Mars, and the people who we're trying to talk to and have conversations with and let them think about our business, our consumers of our products, are in point of fact from another planet when it comes to communication. So today's discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about social licensing, and I think some of my views on what the challenges we have with the notion of social licensing. I'm going to offer you a different perspective about a graduated approach to social licensing, and I'm going to talk about energy literacy in that context from a graduated approach. And then I'll sort of give you some thoughts of where I think you have a real advantage, and this lays the groundwork and touches on some of the critical points that Anne made about leadership, defining your own personal career paths, and using some core competencies to get there, and whether you decide to stay within your technical disciplines or bypass that and go into the leadership roles within your organizations, whether you're in an operating firm or a services firm or an EPCM firm. Some of these things that I'm going to talk about, I think, are real CV builders, and will give you lots of options in that area. So, you're all familiar with the concept of social license to operate. I can't go to a meeting these days, and my job gives me the privilege of going to a lot of meetings, and I hear so much fretting about the social license to operate, I don't even know what the hell that means. And if I challenged you all and I said, you've got a piece of paper and 30 words to describe social license to operate, I can tell you that I'd have as many different perspectives on what that actually means as there are people in this room. And yet, it's being framed as one of the largest obstacles that we face in the industry. And so for a lot of companies, and especially companies that are dominated by like male leadership, the idea of the social license really is born within the regulatory frameworks that we work within. And so instead of getting at the true sort of spirit of what it means to have a social license to operate, we operate at the letter of the law. And the challenge with regulations, of course, as you all know, is that the regulations are usually out of sync with public perception and public demand, right? And so we've got great regulatory systems in Canada. The Alberta Energy Regulator, the new product born of 75 years of innovative regulation, is world-class regulatory framework. But it is still pressed to keep pace with changing social demands and expectations of industry. And so even as good as we are in it, whether it's provincially or federally, we still have some challenges with defining for ourselves and for the broader public what the social license actually means. And so I put it to you that instead of something that's full of meaning, it's actually a phraseology that's bereft of any meaning. So when you think about licensing, though, and we're all familiar with the concept, we're all licensed in one form or another. A PEGA, for example, I would take it most of you in the room are licensed with a PEGA in terms of your careers. Realtors are licensed. All kinds of professions are licensed. And the notion of licensing is based on a set of knowledge standards that are both timeless in the things that don't change, but licensing standards are always changing in a really dynamic way. And they're based on a set of social conventions and social consensuses that have behind them some legal enforcement, and there's all kinds of failure requirements. So if you're a realtor and you violate the rules of your license, you are no longer a realtor and that sort of thing. But the one we're most familiar with in terms of the point I want to make is the notion of your driver's license. And your driver's license is not an entitlement, obviously. It's a privilege that's conferred upon you when you meet certain standards. And so when we think about social licensing, I'm not sure why we don't think about it in that same context. And so the problem with the social license notion as it currently exists is that there's an imbalance of expectations. And what happens is that companies, and I'm sure that if you were really, as you are, in touch with the cultures of your companies, there's this real martyr syndrome that goes on, in particular for operating companies. And why is it us? Why doesn't the public get us? We have a tremendous amount of ignorance. You know, I don't know of any other industry in the world where the consumers of our products are in such an adversarial role with the people who actually produce them. And so that's a real challenge. And I think both sides in that equation, the consumers and the producers of the hydrocarbon products, we don't invest enough in the engagement. And when I say the regulators get it wrong, it's usually a timing. It doesn't matter how much stakeholder consultation and that sort of thing is embedded in the regulatory process. It's always out of sync, and it's never good enough for the public. And as a result of that, you tend to get an imbalance of knowledges. And so think about your friends. Think about when you have barbecues and when you're out at the bar and that sort of thing. And they say, gee, you're a reservoir engineer. What does it actually mean? And you go into a long explanation. And they say, yeah, but what does it actually mean? I'm a board director on the Canadian Heavy Oil Association, and we have a real challenge with some of our younger members who are pilloried right here in Calgary for their chosen careers. And so their companies aren't equipping them with the broader set of context and information to sort of talk knowledgeably about the role that their particular profession plays in industry. So what we end up with is this, what I call the AAA whammy, which is this really powerful impact of adversity, acrimony, and animus. And so if you think about that practically, about some of the major debates that are going around in the way we talk about the Northern Gateway pipeline project, the way the debate about multi-stage hydraulic fracturing is being played out in the public. We had commissioned some research we released last week that talked about the attitudinal differences between Albertans and British Columbians toward fracturing. And really it points to when you have a province that has a culture of oil and gas development versus one that doesn't, what are the challenges inherent in that? And of course we're moving into an era of cumulative impact assessment. So we're not looking at the air separately from the way we look at water and land. But we don't have the right tools for public discourse around these important things. And so you get these dueling facts and perspectives that play themselves out in the media. And this touches on this issue of energy literacy, which I'll go into deeper in a second. So the bottom line, for those of you who know your Gospels well enough, when Jesus returned after roaming the Middle East and teaching and preaching, and he got back to Nazareth, couldn't figure out why nobody was really listening to him. The modern analog for this in a non-Christian context, of course, is parents of teenagers. So when I want my daughter to do something, I go to my neighbor, I say, John, will you tell my, and she goes, I'm going to do this, Dad, because John says it's really cool. And so that's the notion. And so in industry, we feel we're prophets without honor because we're doing great things in the reservoir. We're innovating on all kinds of technological fronts. We're innovating on energy emissions management things, and nobody's actually listening to our stories. So we feel that way. Why can't we get it across to them? And yet the bottom line is how most people outside the industry see us, right? You guys, big oil, you're the rapers of the land, the pillagers of the environment, and so you're taking your profits without any honor at all. And that's where we are. And I want you to remember these two phraseologies because these are critically important, especially for the younger set in the room, critically important to defining your career and moving up through your organization strategically, in my view. So my point on this is, what if there was a process in the social licensing world and that taught and retaught and retaught and retested and tested again, and that defined the way we debate these big challenges in our industry based on an equilibrium of knowledge, right? So you probably live in lives where most of your friends who aren't working directly in the energy sector, you just shake your head in frustration and say, I'm tired of trying to teach these people. You have to ask yourselves, why aren't they learning? And so the whole idea of balanced discourse has to come from balanced knowledge bases. And so what if there was a way besides the regulatory context of having conversations about major projects like Northern Gateway? It's interesting, without telling too many tales out of school, are there any Enbridge employees here? Okay. So we just did a tour for Enbridge. So the JuneWarren-Nickle's Energy Group was hired by Enbridge to take a tour of Aboriginal leaders from northern BC through the oil sands and connect them with Aboriginal business leaders in the Athabasca region. And It was interesting that they tapped us on the shoulder to do it because they understood that what the optics would look like publicly if the pipeline company had actually taken the Aboriginal leaders themselves into it. And it's a shame that Enbridge can't do that without going to a third party, because in that sense, that's that profit without honor syndrome, right? That they knew well enough that they would be pilloried if they were seen to be forcing that perspective on the Aboriginal leaders rather than have them go willingly with a third party for a tour of the oil sands. And I find that problematic in terms of advancing the way we think about projects. So here's my notion. It's a computer, just like my daughter who's about 16, the other one in the picture, she's had her learner's permit. What a great province Alberta is. You can get a learner's permit when you're 14. And that, for those of you who aren't aware, that really comes from Alberta's agricultural heritage, where you needed to actually be legal to drive the pickup truck and the tractor and all that sort of thing. But she's eagerly anticipating her 16th birthday in a few weeks. And she knows that she's going into a graduated licensing project. My older son, who's 25 and 3 months away from that final having to get his GLD or whatever it's called in terms of, so he's gone through a graduated process. But what if we had something in front of the social license to operate called the communicative license to participate? And it was a graduated process that by some form of social compact, companies and stakeholders actually got together and said, you know what? We're going to actually collaborate on navigating toward that final social license. And so the whole result, in my view, would be a lot more consensus. Too often in this industry, we confuse compromise for consensus, and they're two fundamentally different propositions. And then fundamentally, we'd have more dialectic, and there's a fancy word for you, 3:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. But dialectic is about balanced discourse. It's about rational discourse. It's about discourse that seeks a win-win proposition for both parties at the end of it, versus debate, which is the words that we use in the industry more often. And debate is either intended to produce a winner or a loser. And so we've got to be more thoughtful about how we have those conversations with our external stakeholders. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on energy literacy right at the moment, because obviously that's sort of one of the component parts that fits at the bottom of all this as a foundational piece. But as young professionals, you should be aware that there is a rising momentum that's driven by all levels of government in Canada and a lot of the major companies toward an energy literacy movement. And the challenge with energy literacy is it's a challenging concept, because the converse is illiterate. And if you think about yourselves in the course of your day, you may be a reservoir engineer and you're really literate about what's going on in that reservoir. You know everything about, if you're a geomechanical engineer, you know everything about caprock integrity. But step outside your office and try and engage in a debate about global carbon policy, and all of a sudden you've gone from great literacy to being illiterate, all in the space of an hour sort of thing, right? But what's gratifying about this is people are getting serious about the idea of having a more literate, energy literate population. And there's just some examples of where you can see where some of the interest is coming from. The provincial government is huge behind this. There's another big conference in a couple of weeks out in Kananaskis to try and tackle this. But there's some serious weight behind the energy literacy movement. And as young technical professionals, you need to pay attention to this, because this will be a rising tide that, if you catch the right cresting of the wave, will help you define your careers. And to Catherine's point this morning about personal communications, and then what Anne was saying earlier on, this is an important wave to crest with. So just a couple of last things about energy literacy. It's challenging. What is literacy? Is it economic literacy? So if I ask the question of a very talented bunch of people in this room about what the widening of the Panama Canal next year means to Canada's nascent LNG industry, there's a literacy question, but most people in the room probably won't be able to answer it. So what is it about? Economic literacy? Is it about technology? Is it numeracy? Can the average Canadian actually tell you why a liter of gas is the price the way it is when the commodity is here and the gas price is here? The numeracy is a big issue. So these are all the things that people in the energy literacy movement, companies like Cenovus are huge behind this, CAP is huge behind it, and the challenge that they face is getting the public engaged in this. But as I say to my kids, is I got to live an energy unconscious life, you won't. And energy consciousness or awareness will impregnate every personal and professional choice you make. I'll be contributing to the hydrocarbon cycle by decomposition. And you will be challenged by thinking actively, more actively about energy than my generation did. So, but here's where I'm getting to the nut of it all. Energy, this literacy movement, is not going to go anywhere without a major rethink about how the way we communicate. So, and I'm not going to say the thing that I'm going to say next because I'm pandering to a female audience. I appreciate being the only male speaker because there's no lineup in the bathroom, right? I had it all to myself. But I think the most dangerous thing in our industry is the male engineer. And it's the male engineer in a leadership position with an MBA. And you'll see why in a few minutes, okay? And I've got a lot of friends with that label on them. But fundamentally, if you think about communication and communication theory, you as technical professionals come out with a predisposition to a particular type of communication thinking, the encoder-decoder model, right? So it's, and you see this in industry all the time. Oh, well, look at the improvement in our steam-to-oil ratios over the last 3 years. What don't they get about that? Isn't that heroic? The person on the other side of that equation, that communicative equation, is just eyes glazed over. And so the natural scientists, and that's where your legacy is coming from the natural scientists, are at war with the social scientists. And so those who oppose the industry, who have their training in anthropology and history and political science and all those social sciences, they understand one fundamental fact. People communicate through meaning making, right? It's like the old newspaper adage, never let the facts stand in the way of a good story. And they realize that, and that's why we're always behind the 8 ball in this industry, trying to figure out how to communicate with the broader public and, with ourselves. So the bottom line is we need a major rethink in terms of our communicative strategy in this industry, and I think you're the audience to do it. So, John Gray, this is where I get into trouble with the pop culture references. This was a seminal book long before Dr. Phil came along, right? And I know the people who are grinning at me that I'm making eye contact with, the ones of my generation know this very well. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And this actually is the best-selling book of all time right now, and it's spawned a whole bunch of additive things in terms of TV shows around the world and that sort of thing. But fundamentally, if you're a younger member of the audience and you haven't read it, what John Gray's proposition is men and women have different communication modalities, different communication needs, and different ways of thinking about how to navigate their relationships. And it was almost like I paid you in the back to talk about the whole floor dynamic, because that was a John Gray moment in terms of how men and women come to terms over it. But if I think about replacing men and women with industry and consumers, some very interesting propositions arise. So I'm going to steal 4 points from John Gray. And, right at the outset, I know John Gray was widely criticized in terms of his, grossly oversimplifying some of these things. But you don't sell 7.5 million books without an appreciative audience, right? And so it's one of those, almost like Dale Carnegie, it's a timeless work that you can go back and read and reread because it gets at the fundamentals right from the days of the cavemen. But one of the things that he focused on in his book was what happens to communicative dynamics in times of stress, times of emotional need, and times of emotional and personal validation. So here's where I think you, as engineers, have a real opportunity, as female engineers, to take advantage of a different way of thinking about communication. So I'm going to just talk very rapidly about 4 key points that he made. John Gray would tell you that men exist to fix things. And I think about all my male engineering friends and geoscience friends, and that's exactly the way they think. They think, I'm going to improve my water inputs. I'm going to, improve that number of frac stages, and that's going to do it. And everybody should be impressed by the way we do those things. And what John Gray would say is that women would understand the need to talk about those things and to communicate. And so if you're thinking about that sort of industry-consumer dynamic, isn't it better to talk about fracturing in a different way than we talk about it right now? Because the way we've been talking about fracturing as one key industry example isn't working. It isn't working at all. And so, the male engineer and the male technologist seeks accolades for the way he's putting these new innovations out there. Women, on the other hand, and this would be the consumer kind of notion, is that they seek appreciation for the input to those fixes. And so what if we thought about a different way of thinking about hydraulic fracturing and the way we communicate with stakeholders? So men also, John Gray didn't explicitly use the words man cave. That's more of a 2000s pop culture reference. But it was about how men retreat during tough times and times of stress. And as an industry, we're doing that right now, right? It's this, oh, the woe is me, the big martyr syndrome, and we're retreating when we should be advancing in terms of our communicative front on how we deal with some of these major issues. I spent earlier time this year in Poland and the Ukraine doing presentations about Alberta's unconventional resource industry to the Poles and the Ukrainians who are seeking to reduce their dependence on Russian gas. And you just need to go away and look back and see your own jurisdiction through other people's eyes to realize, holy smokes, do we ever have it well here? And then I think about when we were there, how countries like Poland and the Ukraine and other places around the world look to Canada for leadership. And we've been leading very well from the reservoir for decades. In the complexities of the surface reservoir, not so much. And so I'd suggest that the industry is headed into the man cave, and that when you define how you can contribute, and I'll get to my salient points on this, have some of the answers to those challenges. So just a couple other quick points. That John Gray would talk about men and women speak different languages from different perspectives, and men are very literal in the way they communicate, and women quite appropriately lean toward creative license. And men, again, seek validation for their fixes. So we rest too much on our technological laurels because we think that the public's actually interested in our innovations around technology. They couldn't give a rat's ass about it, quite practically speaking, because we don't work hard enough to align the things that we're doing in the reservoir, on the surface facilities, with the emissions management, with the way technology plays out in their lives. If you talk to them about your achievements in the reservoir the same way they appreciate their iPhone, you're going to have a whole different conversation, right? Quite practically. And that's our biggest challenge. And when we go out to the industry, we think that people believe that technology is the fix, and it's the panacea to all of our woes. And so there's this last notion of aligning different emotional needs. And the industry's emotion are not the public's emotion when it comes to energy production and energy consumption. And until we understand that, until we understand how people actually make meaning, think about your friends and think about your families and think about the conversations you have. They make an entire different meaning around energy. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with people who are based here in Calgary and who have family and relatives in other parts of Canada, and they dread going home because of the conversations. People learn more through the media, or think they learn more through the media about the oil sands industry or the unconventional gas industry than they do from actually the people, the sayers of the truth. So, as I wrap up here, building on what Anne and Catherine have said, so when you think about your own personal career advancement, I think if you take a real strategic look at your communicative talents, and you think about the social license to operate, and you think about your company's needs from a communicative point of view, and that's not only internally, but externally, right? So, practically speaking, you should start journalizing these literacy moments that you have. And so, define what your friends say. Keep a journal of your conversation with your friends in terms of these literacy moments. And, and all of a sudden you'll see in that a plan of attack for tackling one of our major challenges, how to communicate with the public. Ask yourself, where am I literate and where am I illiterate? I know there's a huge LNG debate. I was at a meeting the other day briefing the Deputy Minister of International Trade for the federal government, where a senior leader in industry said, if we get the LNG dynamic right, we're going to have a sectoral opportunity the magnitude of the oil sands. And he's absolutely right. But we won't get there unless we know how to communicate effectively. And I think, the strategic communicator, and there's so many bright spots of strategic communication in the industry so far, that I think that, for people who take that on, it's a personal challenge and personal competencies will go far in their organizations. So ask yourself, where am I literate? And what learning do I have to do? How do I get out of the reservoir, so to speak, and broaden my energy literacy horizons? And how do I participate? How many people in this room are actually cognizant enough to have a good conversation about the low-quality fuel standards that's about to go to the vote in the European Parliament? Right? Kind of shameful. But it has practically, when you think about the next 25 to 30 years of your horizon, and I see Anne nodding because she gets that from a stat oil perspective, that's an energy literacy dynamic. And if you make yourself conversant with the principles of those debates and why it's important for Canada to be able to sell bitumen-based products to Europe, that will define your career path a lot more effectively than your competencies with the slide rule and the algebraic equation. Truthfully speaking, absolutely. So, and then define your company's and your community's role. And so pay attention to what your companies are doing. One of the challenges, downtown Calgary is like a huge stratigraphic diagram, right? You get caught in your stratigraphic layer, you may be in the D&C department or you're in the reservoir department, the drilling department, and you don't think anything actively about what the rest of the company is doing. So, get yourself a learner's permit. Apply for a learner's permit, self-apply, and pick a project. Go internal or go external. Pick something that your company is doing out on the landscape with a group of stakeholders, or pick an interdepartmental opportunity, okay? And try and fix the communication through a literacy means, through this learner's permit process between departments. And be yourselves, because good facts will win the day, but don't mistake the need to understand how the social sciences minds works in terms of communication modality, because it will always go to the heart of the emotional debate. And so find yourself somebody who's a political scientist, a journalist, an economist, an anthropologist, and latch onto that person. And then you'll find out, when I balance my technical knowledge with that social knowledge, I'm going to go far within my organization. So I'm going to end with this. Another rule, the 140 to 3 challenge. So this was me last week. In another part of my life, I'm chairman of the Canadian Petroleum Hall of Fame. I think you can probably see where I was going with my first point. Since 1997, we've inducted 140 men into the Hall of Fame and 3 women. That's shameful. Those 3 women were inducted because of their role in an organization called the Desk and Derrick. You can figure out what that means from sort of where it subjugates women into administrative role. And thank you can be in the Hall of Fame because you knew how to lick envelopes. But the challenge I would put to you is, we don't get any women into the Hall of Fame because nobody nominates them, right? And so, as I said to everybody at the induction dinner last week, you all know a Hall of Famer. And I think if you guys think long and hard enough about it, you know a female Hall of Famer. And so, until we deinstitutionalize these kind of ratios for the Petroleum Club in the Hall of Fame, you know, it's that old, again, a popular culture reference from the 70s and the 80s for Virginia Slim cigarettes. You know, you've come a long way, baby. And until we deinstitutionalize things, we still got a long way to go. So, thank you very much.